Yeah, and we recorded that too. So bringing energy, enthusiasm, idiocy. Hello and welcome to Colonial Outcasts, the anti-imperialist podcast that every self-respecting Christian evangelical Zio preacher would vehemently denounce as heresy. Today we're going to be talking about the fracturing imperialist order by looking at Turkey, Israel's sudden interest in liberating Cyprus, Turkey's agenda in northern Cyprus and beyond, the imperialist reshaping of the Middle East to counter China and Russia, and the coming turmoil of our world. So it's going to be fun. As the Israeli Knesset votes almost unanimously to formally annex the West Bank, and Netanyahu declares a re-invasion and occupation of the Gaza Strip with what troops exactly? The U.S. Army couldn't even do it. We see the entity positioning itself to begin yet another self-destructive political and territorial war against the much larger and more militarily powerful Republic of Turkey. And there are two flashpoints of conflict at play here. Well, two main ones in Syria over the David corridor, which we might get into, and the focus of this episode over the island of Cyprus. This is an important and complex issue, especially if you're a Cypriot, because Israel is literally, as a matter of state policy, trying to turn the strategically invaluable island into a backup colony and military bastion. How lucky then we are to be joined by a Cypriot geopolitical analyst currently in Cyprus, dealing with all the insufferable Israeli settlers blasting their equally insufferable electronic music from their gated communities. Elena Xenophontos, thanks so much for coming on as always.
Oh, it's going to be a good one. Thank you for having me on again.
Yeah, a lot of crazy messaging has been coming out recently. I just wanted to I was just apropos of nothing looking at the various military strengths of Turkey and Israel. Not that I think like a hot conflict will happen, but I just kind of wanted to front load this episode with a study by the Organization of Global Firepower, the leading annual defense review since the early 2000s. So here's a side-by-side comparison showcasing the relative conventional fighting strengths of Israel and Turkey for the year of 2025. It's actually quite amusing. So 1 second, I got to pull this thing up. All right. Yeah, Global Firepower's been around, and they're like the best at this. So basically, Turkey's ranked 9th in terms of military power, Israel 15. Comparison in brief, the only advantage Israel really has is air power. They're outclassed in every other category. I don't agree with geography when the Global Firepower assesses Israel to have more better geography conducive to warfare because they have no strategic depth and they're tiny. And Turkey has like every type of landmass. And then population rank, like literally it's silly. So I just wanted to point this out. Naval power, obviously Turkey with its massive coastline is a fleet strength ranked 17th globally, and Israel's 45th. So anyways, there's that. I just wanted to kind of front load that apropos of nothing before we start talking about great power politics and proxy wars and stuff like that. All right. So I do see a actual hot conflict unlikely, but the use of proxy forces both in Syria and occupied Cyprus remain a possibility that both countries are preparing for. The reason I bring this up is because the Israeli propaganda apparatus is very sophisticated, not in its messaging, which has been irrevocably discredited, but in its reach. It penetrates our legacy media, academic institutions, and religious organizations. And over the past 2 months, the messaging from evangelical leaders for their congregations no longer only focuses on the existential threat to Israel by a nuclear Iran, but for some bizarre reason, they're now talking about a Turkish invasion. Isn't that weird? Here's Pastor John Hagee talking late last month, about 10 days ago, about the Turkic invasion of Israel. Hagee has met with every Israeli prime minister since Menachem Begin and has been a vocal supporter of the nation, even organizing large-scale pro-Israel rallies and lobbying efforts. His organization, CUFI, Christians United for Israel, has become a major political force, influencing U.S. policy and advocating for Israel's interests in Washington, and is very much on message with every permutation of Israeli Hezbollah. Sorry to subject you to this, Alina, but I wanted to anchor our not insane geopolitical perspectives by contrasting it with this insanity, which is part of the state information apparatus. Christian evangelicals.
Nations are going to come against Israel. Why are they coming? And what's going to be the end result? Let's quickly go through that. The prophet Ezekiel describes in detail the coming Russian invasion of Israel as the Gog-Magog war of Ezekiel 38:39. Ezekiel 38 verses 1 through 3 says these things. That God is the leader of the invasion, so he's a man. So just for fun, let's say that this is Vladimir Putin. Magog, according to historian Josephus, represents modern-day Israel. Ezekiel 38:3 mentions the word Rosh, which definitely is Russia. Russia is leading a group of nations in an invasion of Israel in the future. The nations coming with Iran against Israel, as recorded in Ezekiel 38. Turkey, Syria, Libya, and Germany. Those are
Okay. Anyways, just we like to have some flair on there. Do you want to give like a unpacking analysis of that? Because honestly, I've heard him say things like that before, but Turkey is a new one.
Yeah, it's also to be expected because I think even in the last episode you and I had together, we had actually briefly kind of discussed towards the end of that episode the fact that Turkey is now becoming a disruptive force, I guess, for the imperialist agenda in the region. Fundamentally, not because it's necessarily not a comprador state, it has been up until this point, but obviously under the guise, Turkey still has its own ruling class, its own bourgeoisie, and will always try to obviously accumulate power for itself. And that's what Turkey has been doing in Syria. It's what it's been doing between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Cyprus, and even now Lebanon, based on the reports that we'll discuss a little later on, basically expanding on our previous episode. And I had actually argued, and what we were saying in the last episode is that because Turkey is now trying to become this energy hub, a trade sort of hub, and one that would basically redefine the geopolitics and the economic sort of power dynamics within the region in a way that would sort of undermine and undercut the imperialist ruling class, we're now seeing Turkey being added to the list of countries that are going to invade Israel, that are a threat, because the idea is Turkey is becoming a disruptive force. So that's just like a little quick summary for now.
Yeah, and I do agree with this. We're seeing over the past couple months articles like this in the Rand Corporation, which is a hawkish think tank here in Washington, turning towards Turkey, why NATO needs to lean into its relationship. If you guys don't know, just for the audience, Turkey has been a member of NATO since the 50s. And since then, Turkey's relationship with NATO has always been complex, characterized by both strong alliance ties and periods of friction. Turkey's geographical location bordering both Europe and the Middle East makes it a crucial player in NATO's security architecture. And Turkey's large and relatively modern military, particularly its air force with F-16s, contribute significantly to NATO's capabilities. And they've been actively also pursuing relationship with other powers, including Russia, which has raised concerns among some NATO allies. They buy a lot of Russian oil. In essence, it's a dynamic one shaped by a strategic location. But of course, it's trying to serve its own interests here. And that's why you're getting these kind of think pieces from various think tanks, which are asserting Turkey sees itself as an independent power, not a subordinate NATO member, and its leaders will continue to make deals that best serve their own national interests. Instead of resisting this reality, NATO should find ways to leverage it. So a lot of people are seeing where this is going as well within defense circles. And it's a matter of concern and discussion within Washington as well. And I think before we start talking about the fracturing imperial order that's actually going on right now, and Turkey's a great example, obviously, to anchor it with, let's honestly talk about the island of Cyprus, because this is going to be like a flashpoint between, our extension of Israel, empire in Israel, and Turkish interests within Cyprus in the context of their relationship with NATO as well. Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. So let's just start with the basics. The island of Cyprus has a long and complex history of occupation, which Alina is going to talk about later. But what actually is happening right now? Well, Israel is becoming more and more invested in the island of Cyprus. There are there are UK bases, air bases in Cyprus as well. So let's just check this out real quick. There is a housing crisis and a settlement crisis currently going on.
Part of the Mediterranean, a quiet transformation is unfolding. Thousands of Israelis are buying homes and land in southern Cyprus, settling in strategic areas, building communities, and raising political alarms. Cypriot politician Stefanos Stefanou warns, "Our country is being taken away." Zionist schools and synagogues are forming ghettos.
Recently, we see the phenomena of the creation of closed gated areas, ghettos, by Israeli nationals, with the creation of Zionist schools and synagogues, sweeping acquisition of important economic units and large areas of land, while serious newspapers of Israel speak of a targeted policy of expansion of Israel and Cyprus.
In 2023, Israeli media asked the question, is Cyprus becoming a second Israel? In just 2 decades, the Israeli population here has grown from 400 to over 12,000, with around 3,000 newcomers each year. After the Haifa port was damaged during clashes with Iran, Israel moved quickly. Plans were revealed to buy a Cypriot port, to inspect gas-bound aid and secure Israeli imports. But this idea isn't new. Back in 1899, Zionist activist David Treach proposed Cyprus as a Jewish colony. Even Theodore Herzl saw the island as a strategic asset under British rule. Today, some Israeli conservatives speak again of Greater Israel, a vision rooted in biblical geography, extending far beyond modern borders. Cyprus may still wave its flag, but the shape of its future may already be shifting.
So basically what I'm seeing is they're priming the narrative for a conflict with Turkey, whether hot or cold, not just in evangelical circles, but among the Israeli population itself. You know, the process of public normalization for this is already in its opening stages, I'd say. And here's an article that you sent me. I'm going to pull it up, and hopefully you can give us some context on what's going on your island right now. This one is Northern Cyprus is also an Israeli problem. It is not Israel's role or desire to liberate Northern Cyprus. However, if the threat from the area reaches a critical threshold, Israel's strategic posture must shift. Israel, in coordination with Greece and Cyprus, must prepare a contingency operation for liberating the island's north. Given everything that's going on in Gaza, Syria, Lebanon, and the expansion of the war in the West Bank and the Strip, this just seems like something really self-destructive that they can't handle, but they're going to keep pushing for it. Why?
As we said, they're going to be targeting Turkey. They're trying to undermine Turkey and to undercut Turkey. This is one of the main interests that they have, but also much like the video that we just played, because Cyprus itself actually is a key strategic interest of the Zionists, and it has been since pretty much the inauguration of Zionism itself. And I just want to provide a small bit of historical context here because it's going to matter going forward in this conversation. Much like the video said, since pretty much the 1890s, the Zionists have tried to basically take and occupy Cyprus or colonize Cyprus at least 3 times. And in fact, the most serious approach was around 1939. And I even think I sent you some screenshots of, I think, a thesis.
I'm actually going to pull it up real quick. So this is by Girl SS 1979, Zionist Plans in Cyprus 1896 to 1948, the Turkish Yearbook of International Relations. This is where the excerpt comes from. Reading just one paragraph. The most radical, ambitious, and detailed scheme for a Jewish settlement in Cyprus is the one submitted to the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and Malcolm MacDonald, Anthony Eden, and Winston Churchill on 11th March 1939 by 3 Jewish leaders. The plan, titled A Solution to the Jewish Problem, proposed the entire evacuation of the present population of Cyprus, which should be settled in the district of Salonika, and Jews living in Salonika would be transferred to Cyprus. Thus, room would be open for Jewish settlement in Cyprus, and it was added that all transfer costs would be paid by Jewish sources. The details of the plan, were that. So, like this is nothing new at all.
Yeah, Cyprus is actually one of the most serious contenders. And as Theodor Herzl also sort of outlined, was that Palestine was always considered too small for Israel and for their overall ambitions, but fundamentally was considered too small for the imperialist agenda within the region. And when we're speaking of Greater Israel, something that I have discussed before, Greater Israel is more so, although it has obviously like this religious packaging that they try to sell it to in order to justify to the Israeli population themselves and through these religious lines, the actual strategic benefit of having a greater Israel is rooted in the fact that you have complete economic and resource control over a very fundamentally important region in the world. And in fact, even Ben Gurion, and I think we've discussed this before, this is one of the reasons why he said they needed the occupation of Lebanon, they needed the occupation of the Litani River. And in fact, in this particular document, it outlines the idea of a greater Palestine, and Cyprus fell within the realm of a greater Palestine. So what they initially wanted was the area of Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Cyprus, and actually Rhodes Island, which is obviously now part of Greece. This was kind of the landmass that they initially wanted because of the, like I said, it's close to the Suez Canal. These are oil-rich territories, and it's a strategic interest that connects the East with the West. So again, this was a very important. Cyprus has always played a key important role, and in fact, I think in the 1940s they had actually brought around 50,000 Jews over to the island during obviously World War II. And the idea was to actually even test trial the settlements here. Actually, between 1939 and 1945, they were trying to test trial it here. And the only reason that failed was fundamentally because of the resistance movements that were taking place here, and also extreme hostility by the Christian population, obviously against these Jewish, migrants that were also beginning to sort of take over some of these jobs. And these sort of conflicts were actually outlined in that particular document that I had sent you. And because obviously the British imperialism, British colonial rule and empire were slowly kind of falling apart, and there was all these movements that were occurring in different places, in Palestine included, this began to be a failing project. But also because of the fact later on of its proximity to the Suez Canal, the British actually wanted to keep Cyprus for itself. But again, Cyprus was always a strategic of strategic importance to the idea of Israel, its purpose within the region, its surveillance operations, and its control over resources. And in fact, in 2007, between 2007 to 2015, there have been multiple papers that were published by universities in Israel that still spoke about the fact that Cyprus should and remain a critical component to Israeli foreign policy because, and this is one of the papers described it as the springboard to the Aliyah, which is obviously, the return to the Holy Land, etc. And so what we've been seeing here, and what we've been seeing over the course of the last 10 years is this kind of, growth of Israeli investment and complete takeover over key fundamental economic sources on the island. So, for example, right now, the water supply in Cyprus is going to be pretty much owned and controlled by Israeli corporations. Again, this is a Zionist a goal. This has been a Zionist sort of policy, which they've executed throughout the region.
Yeah, I mean, most recently, they took control of the majority of Jordan's water supply as well. It's a way of, being able to enact on everybody else what they're doing in Gaza. It's the same template over and over again. Shut off the water, shut off the aid, access to everything.
Exactly. They've done it to Syria. They're doing it to Jordan. I mean, Jordan is basically being starved of water, and they rely on Israel, and they're depending on Israel in order to be able to kind of provide for them. And one of the things that Ben Gurion had said is that we want to occupy the Litani River in order to basically also be exercise control over Lebanon as well, because as we've said over and over again, water is a very important resource to have in terms of your economic prosperity, in terms of agricultural development, and overall economic sovereignty. If you don't have access to water, you basically have it's equally as important as oil. You have a asphyxiated economy, and this is how Israel exercises control over its neighbors. And something I also want to say: the politician that spoke in that video isn't just any politician. He is the leader of the main opposition in Cyprus, of one of the two largest parties, and probably, either the largest or the second largest party, depending on, the kind of percentages, depending on the year you kind of look at it. But it is one of the most popular parties on the island, and like I said, the leader of the opposition in this country. And he spoke specifically about exclusive Zionist settlements that are being set up on the island. And it's not even just in the southern part, but interestingly, even in the northern territories, the Turkish occupied territories. And this is where it gets even more interesting. And actually, I think I also did send an article where they discussed sort of the way that Israel is coming into the south, and they're buying out mass territories.
Yeah.
In those territories, they're exclusive. They're basically almost Jewish exclusive territories.
So looking at this, Cyprus, the Cypriot government is being more short-sighted than the Portuguese back in the day, because these land acquisitions are being carried out through what is referred to as a golden visa, a residency by investment scheme that allows non-EU nationals to acquire residency by investing in property. Remember, Portugal did this and they had to stop because a bunch of rich foreigners were buying these golden visas in order to purchase property, and they were turning themselves into landlords and squeezing the local Portuguese population for rent and access to just about everything. So yeah, the same thing is happening here in Cyprus right now. And, a lot of realtors are quoted as saying Israelis tend to buy large land parcels featuring spas and resorts, gated communities, so to speak. Pila has become their unofficial hub. So between 2018 and 2025, the number of Israelis residing in Cyprus has surged from 65,000 to 15,000. And those are probably old numbers too, I think, since the war.
I was going to say these are grotesquely underestimated numbers, because there has been an official policy by the government to not actually count or calculate sort of the influx of Israelis on the island. First of all, that number is supposed to be between apparently the 2000s and over the course of 2 decades. We know that following October 7th, we had within a week or two an additional 10,000. And that number has been growing since. And it's not just happening in the south. And this is what's actually even more alarming. It has been recordedly happening in the north. And this was prior to even 2023 on October 7th. And in fact, I think, again, I sent you some articles if you want to reference them. But again, in 2021 and 2022, there were articles coming out of the occupied northern territories in Cyprus that were discussing the fact that Israelis were basically purchasing mass amounts of land, which, again, this land in the north belongs to refugees, internal Cypriot refugees who now live in the south. And they had bought, according to those reports back in 2021, around 25,000 acres of land. And they were establishing, again, exclusive settlements and gated communities that had sparked a mass outrage within the population in the north. And they were calling for the banning of Israelis from purchasing property, which did go through. However, they found a loophole in the system. And the loophole in the system in the north was that effectively, because Israelis have dual citizenship, they're able to essentially use, for example, if they have an American passport or a Russian passport or a French passport, they will use those passports instead to be able to purchase these properties. And this is all happening given the fact that, this is also Turkish occupied territory, which means that Turkey was very well aware up until this point that this was happening, and they allowed it to happen. But this is also part and parcel of the policy that Turkey has to kind of eliminate the rights of Cypriots to their territory in the north, which is obviously an ongoing problem, and also the rights to return if there's going to be whether a one-state or a two-state solution on the island. And so they have been gradually but incrementally basically purchasing property. They now basically are going to be controlling the water reserves in the country. They're establishing settlements, but they're also outbidding, like you said, they're outbidding the local population out of rents, out of even owning shops. I can tell you, this is a bit more of an anecdotal example, but where I kind of grew up, there was in the city center, where Cypriot locals have always had their shops. They're now selling them because a lot of those shops have been bought out by Israelis, and Israelis demand to have essentially secluded areas as a result of security concerns. So they're they're kind of isolating those areas, which means that local Cypriot shop owners are unable to have the same level of business that they once had, because these areas have now become like isolated or secluded, gated areas. And so they're selling off their own shops and their own businesses because of it. And this is exactly the same thing that basically they had done to Palestine, and we're seeing the same thing happen here. And now going to go back to this article, and what's interesting here is that now we're seeing Israel kind of preparing the groundworks in order to further not only infiltrate Cyprus, but to so-called liberate it, which is ironic given the fact that they're occupying and ethnically cleansing Palestinians. But, you know, I guess they want to liberate the occupation of the Cypriots in the north. And they're claiming that the reason that they're doing this, and we can sort of take a look at it, it's fundamentally because, if you want to read it out.
Yes, I just got this paragraph. Yet the threat is not solely military. Lacking effective international oversight, the occupied area has become a hub for terrorism, financing, and money laundering, with Iranian and Turkish illicit funds flowing through shell companies to support Hamas and other terrorist groups. Documents seized during Operation Guardian of the Walls 2021 and Iron Swords 2023 in Gaza revealed Hamas's plans to establish an operational branch in Turkey and northern Cyprus, tasked with carrying out attacks against Israelis in Europe.
The irony is here that they're referencing these so-called leaks or the documents that they accumulated, but I have not found any evidence of what it is that they're even talking about.
They never produce anything. They haven't produced any evidence since of anything, even the people that they've supposedly killed, aside from Yahya Sinwar, the entire time of their prosecution of Gaza over the past 2 years. They do not provide evidence for anything. They just say stuff, and we're supposed to believe it.
But this is the thing. So the one thing I will agree with about that article is that the north of Cyprus, the occupied territories in the north, because they're not internationally recognized, it is a black hole for a lot of criminal activity, money laundering. But this has been the situation now for 5 decades since the occupation, because again, it's an area that acts outside the sphere of international law. It's not recognized. So what goes into the north of within the occupied territories, there's very little sort of surveillancing or kind of information that comes out. But to be fair, and I want to be absolute about this, and this is where I want to provide a little bit of like Cypriot history, like to contextualize this. This is something that has served Western imperialism up until this point for a good long time, because Cyprus still functions as a colony. It's a colonized country in every aspect. And having, if we go back, I just want to outline this specifically. I want to highlight that within Cyprus, there is no Greek and Turkish population. There is just a Cypriot population. And that's very important, because even with the Israeli document that we saw, the article, they speak about this Greek and Turkish conflict. There is no Greek and Turkish conflict on the island. There is a Cypriot population that is multi-religious. We have Christian Orthodox, we have Muslims, we have Maronites, and we have Armenians. And before the British colonial rule of the island, the Cypriot population functioned as a single unit. There were intermarriages. They lived in the same communities. They functioned as a single unit. But the British had adopted the Turkish millet system. And under the Turkish millet system, people were categorized by religion. So you had the Rum millet, which were the Christian Orthodox, and then you had the Muslim millet, which were obviously the Muslim population. And what the British did, and this is why I'm mentioning it, you'll see in a little bit. What the British did is that they basically tried to turn those religious categorizations, and they did so, into ethnic categorizations. So we have ethnic religious identities that were created out of British imperialism. They decided to call Christian or people who have the Christian Orthodox faith Greek, people who are Muslim Turkish, people who are Maronite Arab Cypriot, and people who are of the Armenian Church Armenian Cypriot, therefore creating these sort of divides. And then under the British, it was for the first time we saw those divides take the form of like these legislative councils that they established I think it was in the 20s. And in those legislative councils, they began to segregate these communities and only allow them to have representatives they segregated their representatives, and each member of those community only had a right to vote for a member within their own community. So we had this political and legislative division that began and continued under the British Empire, colonial rule of the island. And in fact, it was the British that actually began to introduce in the school curriculum on the island mainland Greeks and mainland Turkish school curriculum in the separate schooling systems in order to create nationalist identities, pseudo-nationalist identities among the Cypriot community in order to create intercommunal violence. And they amplified this specifically in the 20s and the 30s because at that time, following the 1917 revolution, there was a pan-Cypriot sort of socialist and communist uprising where all the communities got together and they were pushing back against sort of British under the British colonialism, and because this was obviously any sort of establishing a communist island and liberated island in this such a geostrategically important location. The British was not something the British were willing to accept, and we saw that obviously how that manifested itself. Even Nazet, who wasn't necessarily a communist, but in terms of like his more socialist policies and how he pushed back against the British, they were not going to allow that to happen in Cyprus. So at that point, they started to really push forward these nationalist concepts. They allied with the aristocracy in Cyprus, which was the church, in order to suppress the Communist Party. They banned the Communist Party. They exiled the communists. They banned their literature, and they started to push forward Greek and Turkish nationalism in order to create intercommunal violence that would distract people from obviously the British colonial rule. And in many ways, the British kind of created the perfect conditions in order to establish a so-called resistance movement that was calling for enosis, and that is where that movement alone is what created the most tensions that eventually led to the occupation of Turkey and the fact that Cyprus was never able to be free. Why? Because in 1960, when they gained their independence, Cyprus was one of the only countries that had to give 4% of its territory to the British in order to establish what we call today Rafa Grotiri and the Jaya, which is the two British bases, these enclaves, which belong to the UK. They're considered to be British enclaves that have been used over the decades to assert imperialist objectives in the region. I mean, the war in Iraq, a lot of the planes were flying off from the north. They use it for mass surveillance. They use
strikes
it for
in
surveillance
Yemen,
and control the Suez Canal. Strikes in Yemen of recent, and even now we're seeing how they're basically assisting Israel in their genocide in Gaza. It's all happening from Cyprus. And more interestingly, and this is where I'll finish it off here. In 1964, the president of the United States Johnson had actually conducted a plan to divide Cyprus into two and to provide Turkey with the north in order to establish its own military bases to secure its own interest in the region, and obviously to give the south to Greece. But that was not acceptable to Greece. But as we'll see, the Greek junta coup, backed by the CIA at the time in 1974, basically brought about that exact result in Cyprus, which is the division of Cyprus into two, and that. And the reason that happened was to keep Cyprus within the periphery of NATO, and that was important because Turkey is a NATO country, Greece is a NATO country, and by keeping the bases, by keeping the two British enclaves on the island, the idea was to basically secure, the interests of the West on the island. And in fact, I'll just say this as well. One last small thing, actually. It's precisely the reason why the USSR, this is important. It's precisely why the reason the USSR actually was probably the strongest advocate against the division of Cyprus, because it understood that if Cyprus was to be divided between the British, Turkey, or basically NATO, it would be catastrophic, not just for its own people, but obviously for the region. And we're seeing how now that's being sort of played out. However, now Turkey being a disruptive force within NATO itself, and this is actually outlined in this article. It says that that even Article 5 would not be basically of NATO would not actually even come into play if there was some kind of conflict with Turkey, because Turkey is now considered some sort of an outcast. So we're seeing how Cyprus's particular role now has to change. The division, the Turkey's control over the island, and the current two sort of the division no longer serves imperialist interests. So we're going to start seeing that change as the new Middle East takes form.
Yeah, and that's happening exactly right now. So Erdogan is building a palace. One second, let me find an article and an image. Builds palace, Cyprus. Yes. Here we go. Sorry, guys. Pulling this up real quick. All right. So all that's true. Erdogan opens North's new palace. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on Saturday, this was from last May, opened Turkish Cypriot leader Ern Tatar's new official residence. So we were all together, quoting, "We are all together in great excitement and enthusiasm. Today we are putting another seal on these lands. We are putting another seal on these lands. Today we were putting another seal on these lands." He said it twice. I said it a third time because I wanted to emphasize the precise language he's using. Seal associated with royalty, with monarchism. Today we are bringing another magnificent work to the Turkish Cypriot people, and we are not holding just any ordinary opening ceremony here. At the same time, we are declaring our will, our determination, our love of freedom, he said. Okay, so basically everybody knows that, you know, when you start to declare your rule, your imperial rule of a place, what do? You throw up a monument, you throw up a palace, even if you only visit it once. It is, as he said, a quote seal of authority upon the land. Should we do a primer on neo-Ottomanism? Like, would that help, do you think?
I mean, we could. You could. We could if you want. I have no problem. Um, okay, how do I give a small, quick primer without going on
No,
a
I mean,
lengthy one?
I can do it real quick.
Go,
It's just
go for it.
I just see the behavior in the north of Cyprus as being very endemic of that, like with the language, with what they're choosing to do and build, and their policies enacted there. So neo-Ottomanism is basically like this reactionary, revisionist, inherently monarchist, conservative political ideology, like in Turkey, that discredits like Turkish secular nationalist republic and its reforms and glorifies, I don't know, the bygone Ottoman dynasty and its traditionalist establishments. You know, it's just like any reactionary movement, just like the MAGA movement, going back, you know, to the to like conservative values and stuff like that. And it emerged really at the end of the Cold War with the disillusionment of the USSR. And, you know, there's been a couple waves within it, but the main thing is it's been a term associated with Erdogan's interventionist, expansionist foreign policy in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Cyprus, Greece, Iraq, and Syria. Also, you know, with regards to Armenia and the Azerbaijan as well, which we can get in. You know, it's been rejected, though, as a term by his actual government. Because they would disagree that they are actually trying to not, you know, reinstate the caliphate of the Ottomans. But, you know, it is an interventionist movement. Like you see that in Syria, definitely see it in Cyprus right now. They're trying to extend territorial influence and control beyond their borders.
You know what's interesting? I will also say this, because the divisions among the Cypriot population were always rooted in like this religious identity. Erdogan has specifically gone out of his way, and there was mass protest in the north only just a few months ago, to reintroduce like Islamic education as mandatory in the schooling system. And this is because the Cypriot population, the Cypriots in the north, they are generally secular. Yes, they're Muslim, but they're secular. They're not necessarily practicing or strict Muslims. And he's trying to kind of rein that in. And there were mass protests, and they were calling for Erdogan to basically leave them alone, leave their country alone, leave their education system alone. But the reason he's doing that is because is what you've just said. It's part of this Islamic aesthetic that is rooted in this neo-Ottoman sort of agenda that Turkey generally has. I mean, they're doing the same thing. They've done the same thing in Lebanon as well, in the north of Lebanon, because in the north of Lebanon is where the vast majority of the Sunni population live, including Turkmen. Erdogan has, systematically been providing the north of Lebanon with specific humanitarian aid and investments into schooling systems and specifically Islamic education. And and also very pro-Turkish, propaganda in the north. And the reason he's doing that is to gradually be able to infiltrate in the north, which Turkey has, and members of his establishment have say they have a claim, like a historical claim, and they've said this about Cyprus: a historical claim to the Cyprus, a historical claim to Lebanon, even to Palestine. They've even said the same thing about Palestine. So this is part of Turkey's, Erdogan's rather like neo-Ottoman idea, but it's mostly, he uses kind of rhetoric, but the idea is essentially to establish Turkey as a power within the region, to gain the territory that they believe not only belong to them, essentially, but because these territories are geostrategically significant. And that's why I said in the previous episode, when you look at what Turkey is trying to do, for example, in Syria, they're taking over key territories in the north of Syria, including airports and land, regions that are rich in natural and mineral resources, but also geostrategically important for the establishment of pipelines, while simultaneously, and I've said this before, through obviously their good relations with the new Syrian regime, the idea of maybe even occupying the north of Lebanon, or rather the discussions that were had initially between Israel and Syria that had to do with Syria taking control over the north of Lebanon was specifically a threat to Israel. And this is what is happening in Cyprus as well. It was specifically a threat to Israel because Turkey, according to, I think, The Cradle did an excellent report on this, has a significant intelligence operations that are within the north of Lebanon, because it wants the Tripoli port, which is one of the largest in the region. They want this in order to rival Israel. They want this port in order to establish these alternative trade routes and pipelines between the East and Europe, and they want Turkey to have a significant control over these resources. And it's the same thing that's actually also kind of happening in Cyprus, because if you look at what's happening in Cyprus as well, Turkey not only now wants to keep obviously the northern part of Cyprus, but also there's been the new gas reserves that were in the last 10 years that were found around this particular region. Turkey has claimed that they have the rights to those reserves instead of the actual Cypriot population in the north.
They are trying to become an energy hub, and they don't have a lot of native energy production, so they're not going to not fight over this. It's in their national interest to do so. And just wanted to point that out, that they do have an extreme energy deficiency.
Yeah, and they actually even signed, what was it, the GNA? There was an agreement signed in 2019.
That was the Libya treaty.
The Libya Treaty, yeah, exactly, which is a maritime treaty. It was the Government of National Accord. I think 2019. It was an agreement between Turkey and Libya that Turkey will provide military assistance to the officially recognized sort of leadership of Libya, which itself is in a civil war.
Yeah. The recognized government, was and still is engaged in a conflict with the Libyan National Army, which controls territory in eastern Libya. So that's still going on. But Turkey made overtures to the internationally recognized government to get this thing through.
Yeah, and it was established basically a maritime corridor between Turkey and Libya, cutting through Greece's exclusive economic zone and Cyprus's exclusive economic zone. But this is Turkey trying to claim again rights to gas reserves and to create this kind of energy hub and to become a power within the region. Because again, I just want to get back to Lebanon very quickly, because if Syria was to actually gain control over Lebanon, because Jolani or al-Shara has such close relations with the north of Lebanon, Israel understands that Turkey will essentially have basically be controlling the north of Lebanon and its trade routes. And now as well, recently, with I think today, the establishment of the Zangezur corridor and the United States sort of taking the control over that territory in order to turn Azerbaijan as a new sort of source of energy that will go through Armenia into Turkey and into Europe. Again, this is giving Turkey a very significant position in terms of being, a trade and energy hub. And this will impact the West's and Israel's ability to control the region if Turkey continues to become more powerful. So now this is why Israel is further kind of embedding itself, and we've seen sort of articles like Israel Hayom, who basically saying that Cyprus may need to be liberated. And what they're effectively saying is that we need to push either Turkey out, or they're using Cyprus as well as, you know, Syria, Lebanon, and the kind of proxy conflicts that are being generated here between Israel and Turkey to try to placate Turkey. This is a battle now that's happening to try to pacify Turkey, because as I've said before, the international bourgeoisie will work together in order to sustain imperialism. However, the imperialists, ruling class, capitalists, essentially, never want a power or any state to become too powerful, Turkey being one of them, that it will in any way threaten their interests. But the problem here is as well, is that Turkey is a military power. And if there's any form of antagonism in Cyprus, especially, I mean, they have 40,000 occupation soldiers in the north. And if even if when I'm driving or when I'm on from my city to, for example, the capital, you can see all the Turkish sort of spots easily they would be able to invade and take over the island. But the fact that as well, I think a year and a half ago, Israel also gave Cyprus the Iron Dome, and there were discussions of establishing the Iron Dome here, was to me already a red flag, because it goes to show that there is a plan to try to create, to try to antagonize Turkey via Cyprus, and to eliminate Turkey's influence in the north, to get rid of the occupation in the north that for so long has been acting as this hub where all this criminal activity is happening, the establishment of a one-state solution that will allow Cyprus to sort of take advantage of its resources, and therefore kind of bypassing to a certain degree or limiting Turkey's access to trade routes, pipelines, and gas reserves. But this, to me, would be a foolish endeavor, and it would risk, again, the working class populations of Cyprus, as well as Lebanon, and as we are currently seeing in Syria.
Yeah, and you know, there's nothing Israel can do to militarily dislodge Cyprus. Turkey from Cyprus. But you know, what do they usually do when, you know, they can't actually wage a battlefield conquest? They take land, they buy up property, and you know, it's more of the same. But also, you mentioned that, you know, the international bourgeoisie want Turkey to remain, you know, an ineffective, or at least not a massively powerful regional player, because the U.S. hegemony does not tolerate what they would consider regional hegemons. You know, within defense circles, obviously, I don't agree with the term that Iran is a regional hegemon, but they consider it that, so it needs to be busted down. So they don't want Turkey to become too powerful. But it's interesting too, because a lot of the bourgeoisie within Turkey also want to tread this fine line between like their NATO and EU allegiances with, you know, their own regional interests, because, you know, they don't want to be overstep and get sanctioned. Like, oh, they have most of their capital invested in Western and American markets, you know, so they're playing this fine line game. But we're seeing that they're not going to get really pushed around in the same way that they have been before, or they're at least taking a more pugnacious step forward. And I think a good way to look at this, and this was breaking yesterday, so basically, Turkey rejects the Sweda SDF corridor, citing threat to Syrian unity. So Israel is seeking to establish the David's corridor. You know, we've talked about this before. The David's corridor connects southern Syria, and it links the occupied Golan Heights with Syria's Kurdish-controlled northeast, right? So basically, Turkey has expressed its rejection yesterday of efforts to open a corridor from Sueda in the south of Syria to occupy areas occupied by the Kurdish-led SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, in the country's northeast. You know, saying that it's the plans pose a threat to Syria's unity and undermine its transnational governance process. So basically, the agreement calls for the SDF to integrate its administrative structures into the Syrian state institutions, hand over control of the oil fields, and integrate its armed forces into the official army within 1 year. And of course, you know, the Turkish government sees the SDF as associated with their designated terrorist organization, PKK, which, you know, they made a propaganda piece about how the PKK demilitarized. They didn't demilitarize. They just had one video of like them burning 12 AK-47s. So I have to ask the basic question, I think, because you're, you know, basically taking the lead on this interview. Does Turkey have a vested interest in seeing a strong, normalized with Israel Syrian government, cohesive Syrian government?
No.
Yeah, that's a
I would say it
rhetorical
doesn't
question.
anymore.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. No, absolutely not. This is why I said we're seeing the sort of disintegration of like these imperialist structures. This is what I mean, because all these states, whether it's Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, the United States, the UK, they all came together to bring down the Assad regime in Syria. They
Mhm.
all allied, they all sort of funded the opposition, which is predominantly, as we all know, the opposition was al-Nusra. It was al-Qaeda, groups and organizations for the most part, with the exception, obviously, of the SDF, which was the Kurdish groups. However, they did this because they wanted the fall of Bashar al-Assad. But from that moment onwards, their interests within Syria would diverge, and this clash, this conflict of interest, was going to happen either way. And like I said, there is a point in time where they were aligned, but eventually their interests will clash. And the hierarchy is where we're going to start seeing the hierarchy sort of play out. The United States, at this particular point in time, Israel is an extension of the United States, will back Israel, and in fact is probably acting through Israel, which is why we're seeing, I think, think tanks, even such, I think it was the Atlantic Council, or even the one that you had just shown prior, which
The
are
Rand
speaking about Turkey
Corporation.
being a liability. The
Mhm.
Rand Corporation, which are speaking about NATO, Turkey being now a liability in NATO. So what Israel is doing is not also in isolation. It's part of an extension of the imperialist agenda now against Turkey that is being viewed as a threat. But Turkey itself was foolish to actually even engage in Syria to begin with, because its own borders could easily be ruptured, and now it's also facing its own particular problems. And the fact that it thought at any particular point that Israel and the West would allow Syria to fall within the sort of the realm of control of Turkey, I think is absolutely ridiculous, if I'm being honest with you. So now what's being established is we're going to see the David's corridor being sort of put forward, and it's going to diminish Turkey's influence and control over Syria and its own ambitions in the region. Turkey itself is going to probably have a border issue going forward. And I will say, I am of the personal belief that because Turkey cannot be militarily defeated from Israel, that won't be the case. What I think will probably happen is we're going to see the West begin to target Turkey economically, whether it be maybe through sanctions, or maybe it might be through, through its debt, affecting
Yeah.
its kind of currency, because Turkey's economy, it has been incredibly weak for the last 10, 15 years, with its currency completely depreciated. And so this is a very fragile economic state, in a fragile economic state. And so the West, or rather the United States, would be able to coerce and placate Turkey through its economic coercion.
Yeah.
And how that's going to play out in Syria, in Cyprus, and even in Lebanon is going to be interesting. But yes, they might have a military power, but they don't have the economic capabilities to be able
To
to kind
wage
of
a
push
war
back
of
against
attrition.
the West.
Yeah, I mean they don't
Mhm,
have any ability to wage a war of attrition, especially against a Western ally. Uh,
mhm,
like Israel. So they are walking again a fine line between their position with Eurocentric adjacent position within NATO, and also they have their own interests as well, economic ones. Turkey's national debt in 2023 was reported to be $8.7 trillion, marking a significant increase from the 66.1% from the previous year. Like, that's a massive expansion of debt that they're going on, and it
mhm,
hasn't helped at all. So, um, yeah, they're kind of playing a dangerous game, to be honest. Uh,
mhm.
Obviously, Israel can't dislodge them from the north of Cyprus, but they don't have really much they can do to advance their foreign policy within the region. Also,
I think they're going to, I mean, this is obviously speculative at this point. There's going to be a form of economic coercion to
yeah,
try to, essentially filter out Turkey's maybe surveillance and sort of claims in the north. Now, how that's going to play out is, at this point, we're going to come to see what that means. If that means maybe the establishment of a separate state where Turkey would sort of relinquish power to this, and have a two-state solution. Does that mean they might push for a one-state solution? But whatever the outcome is, the idea would be to diminish Turkey's control and influence in the north to a degree that will be that will appease NATO, Israel, and the United States. Now, how that's going to manifest, I'm not quite sure just yet. But it is alarming to see these sorts of articles being published from within Israel, and it's alarming the fact that they're speaking about things like, Hamas is established. I mean, when they start speaking about Hamas has headquarters in a place, it's not going to go. It's not going to go down very well.
They've got their sights on it, yeah. And I think they might just begin advancing their doctrine of the periphery in the north of Cyprus. Basically, it was something that was created during the time of Ben Gurion to insulate Israel by creating alliances and relationships with non-Arab states. So during its first inception, Turkey was on the list, Imperial Iran, Ethiopia, Sudan, but as the global order began to shift, as the Cold War played out, it extended towards groups, ethnicities, tribes. So the Druze, Maronite Christians, some Alawis as well in Syria. And, they started arming those groups, giving them intelligence support, cultivating diplomatic relationships with them. So if you want a proxy force in the north to basically kick off a low-grade insurgency, well, that's how they would do it.
I agree. And what concerns me, like I said, it's going to be the impact that it's going to have on the Syrian population, on the Lebanese, and on even the Cypriots. Because, for example, whatever the solution is, if there's some sort of escalation in the north, or this would be detrimental even to the population in the north. I mean, at the end of the day, for example, in the case of Cyprus, the invasion and the subsequent occupation later on happened for a particular reason, because the truth of the matter was that the Muslim population was targeted, as well as the leftists. Even Greek-speaking leftists were, if you would like to say Greek-speaking, leftists were also targeted in the south. And so that's what justified the Turkish invasion and occupation. There are still intercommunal conflicts, but also, not just even within the two different communities themselves, but even within the different political factions between the left and the far right, who have these sort of nationalist ideologies, and how that's going to play out on the island. I mean, it's the same thing that's in Lebanon, with all the different sort of the Shia Muslims, the Sunni Muslims. This banking on internalized conflict, and how the imperialist gains within the region are going to impact the working classes and within these states, is what's very alarming, and it's going to play a big significant role as to how it's going to shape the future of the region.
What I'll be interested to see how this plays out is, Turkey is kind of like a non-alignment, even though being a NATO member, stance with, but in the Ukraine war with the United States and Russia. That's why, the original round of peace talks, which were blown up by Boris Johnson a few years ago, were happening in Ankara. There's a reason for that. So I wonder if, they may go the way of, if they are sanctioned and if they are punished for being upstarts, if they may have an increased security relationship with Russia and other more BRICS nations as well, because they're already buying Russian air defense systems right now, which is kind of unprecedented. So definitely something to look out for.
I mean, this is the thing. Turkey always seems to play a double game, and to what extent it's going to backfire, which I believe it will, I don't know how big the backfiring is going to be, but I think it's going to be rather significant, because on the one hand, they still do but purchase sort of military equipment from Russia, but then went at the request of the West in order to basically block, trade routes to the Black Sea, etc. Turkey did it. And when it came to even sort of the induction of certain countries into NATO, they allowed it to happen. Or in 2019, for example, the agreement between Turkey and Bashar al-Assad, the sort of ceasefire agreement, it was Turkey that kind of backstabbed those agreements. And then even the situation in Syria was eventually the way that Turkey supported the uprising, the eventual fall of Bashar al-Assad, and the entire situation that broke out in Syria was not to the favor of Russia, who obviously had backed Bashar al-Assad. So they're playing this game where on the one hand they would appear sometimes that they've got a neutral stance, on the other they've been more pro, at least, or their actions have served more NATO's interests. Now that may change based on the fact that obviously they're becoming a bit of a splinter and a problem for Western's interest in the region.
Yeah, but I think though that NATO, the NATO elites, and the U.S. diplomatic corps will actually try the carrot before they try the stick. Because they're trying to reindustrialize NATO. We're already seeing propaganda movies coming out of Germany. There's a push. Volkswagen has offered to start building tanks again. And, NATO is in a precarious place. Trump has kind of a seesaw relationship, hot on NATO one day, cold the next day. And, part of its power, the Turkey guards its eastern flank. It's its second most powerful military within NATO as well. So I predict that they can get up to a lot more shenanigans, and we're going to see an entire period where, Turkey is kind of going to be trying to wooed back into the NATO fold, just because that's what we're seeing coming out of the academic complex within Washington right now with all these position papers coming out. So I do think they'll have to do something more egregious than fighting Israel over the David corridor to actually cause something drastic to happen in terms of the stick being brought out.
I agree. I think it's not just going to be the David corridor. I think it's going to be basically what's going to happen in Lebanon, how Turkey's going to react there, their influence in the north of Lebanon, Syria, Libya, even all the way through to Azerbaijan and Cyprus. I think the goals and ambitions that Turkey has within these territories, to what extent they'll be able to be placated, is going to, I think, define the outcome of what's going to happen here. I stand by the belief that I think the West will have to eventually use some sort of economic coercion, because the way I also see it is that Turkey isn't necessarily going to back down either. That's the way I'm reading Turkey at the moment.
The final straw is going to be are they holding up or directly sabotaging Trump's effort for a new Middle East, i.e. the pan-Arab normalization with Israel?
I think on the one hand, obviously they've served their purpose, but on the other hand, it's the United States would much rather have Israel be the more powerful and energy sort of hub within the region that will connect with Saudi Arabia, etc., as opposed to having Turkey. And I think this is where I think it's going to play out. I think Turkey has served its purpose. I think Turkey still serves its purpose up to a certain point. But I believe that everything that we're seeing take place with the articles that are being published, with the narratives around Turkey, the way Turkey is now being sort of included in almost in the same sort of line of thought with Russia and Iran, which was not the case even a year ago.
No, it was not. This is all new.
Yeah, I think to me, this reads that Turkey's becoming more of a problem that they want to deal with. And this is how that's going to play out. I'm not quite sure yet, but we'll probably come to see.
Yeah, well, I mean, the gears are turning. We've been at this long enough to recognize what's going on behind the scenes just by the narratives that are being put out. So, another thing to worry about. Here we go. I just wanted to say one thing about Israel's reinvasion of Gaza. What they intend to do is use what little fighting potential and power they have to create humanitarian safe zones, aka ghettos, and then start the occupation process. I was talking to a lot of people who've served in the military over the past couple of days. In fact, I had a discussion with the Gaza whistleblower Anthony Aguilar, who blew the whistle on GHF. And whatever you think, his motivations or legitimacy are, we had a whole discussion about how this is just what they want to do is not militarily viable. They have taken the kind of some of the worst 2 weeks of casualties than they have in months. And there is no plan. We're seeing a complete break in the upper command echelons of both former and current Israeli officials within their defense apparatus say this is insane. It's going to break the army. And what we have to understand too is like, yes, the imperialists have these plans and Israel may have these plans, but they're also spectacularly failing in other theaters, in other sectors as well. So it's anyone's guess how this is all going to pan out, but I definitely did want to cover the Cyprus thing because that, I don't know, it's just an important piece of this entire puzzle.
It is, and that's why I went on a bit of an elaborate explanation on the history because Cyprus was always geostrategically important. It's why the
Yeah, that's
British
why
said
there's
in 1954, we
yeah,
will
it's why
never
the
leave Cyprus. They made it
yeah,
very clear.
yeah, and that's why there's so many crusader castles throughout the island. It
Mhm.
always has been. It's always
So,
been considered that. You know,
yeah.
yeah. I was gonna go back to the Athenian Empire, but I was like, you know what? It's been an hour. You know, we can't. We don't need.
No, but like whether you look at it from, I mean, it always has been the case. All from the Athenian Empire, the Byzantium rule, even when we were ruled by the Arab Caliphate, etc. Cyprus has always been very geostrategically important, and it was the reason I brought the history up there was the way that they have even tried to, I mean, indoctrinate the population here to create these sort of divisions. And I have often said that in many ways, colonialism, imperialism has been successful in Cyprus because imperialism isn't just this oppressive, like the hard rule, but it's soft propaganda as well. And the fact that they indoctrinated the population to the degree that they have, I mean, for example, Cypriots, there have been Cypriots who actually wanted the British bases here as a safety net against Turkey, even though the UK and Turkey have historically, and the US, it was a combined plan between the two to divide the island in the first place. But you see, this is how imperialism operates. It also is how it infiltrates into people's minds in order to justify presence of these these powers on the island. And Cyprus has always served in that way. And I would say, Cyprus, it's not sovereign in the slightest. You have, Turkey in the north. You've got Israel taking over territories all over the south and the north. You've got the British, the British bases who are also acting as imperialist force. And the fact that it's divided in the way that it is will always make it susceptible to imperialist control in the region. And that's the unfortunate reality. And it's really, I mean, Cyprus being part of the Levant, it's just one of the many cases here that is the same thing in Lebanon as well. So I think it's important, in the same way to understand what's happening with the overall region, because what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Lebanon, is happening in Cyprus. And unfortunately, this is all part and parcel of the whole change or the new Middle East project. And this is also connected to what's happening in Gaza, which is just 20 minutes from here. The ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, which is what their agenda is, so that they could, I don't think it was successful, but like it's all connected, is what I'm saying.
I've never asked you. It's 20 miles. It's kind of a long distance. Can you see ambient light could you ever see ambient light from the bombs being dropped?
At the beginning stages, I think, in the first few months when it was some of the most aggressive operations, that's when, that was when it was possible. But it was interesting from here. We saw personally the Iranian attacks on Israel. That was people were at the beach, they were at a house party, and they could just see the Iranian rockets landing all over Israel. So that was definitely very clear to see. With regards to Gaza, it was mostly the first few months that we could obviously see that.
Yeah. I
That's
mean,
how close.
the initial bombing campaign was actually absolutely insane. So, yeah, I mean, Gaza is kind of like the linchpin of all of this as well. So we'll definitely be back to do a whole new episode on that. I don't know who I'm going to have on, probably one of our military people to just kind of discuss what's going on. I think they're going to do a push or a mobilization over the weekend. Or maybe, and if they don't, it's probably because they're just stalling, like logistically, how do we do this? Because it's not logistically possible. So we'll be waiting to see on that. We'll definitely be refocusing on Gaza now that the GHF whistleblower blowback has blown over. And, you know, GHF is actually going to be the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, all a mercenary company led by a Christian evangelical billionaire named Johnny Moore. It's actually expanding operations in the Gaza Strip. So we're going to come back to talk about that. And I know everyone's exhausted. I'm glad we got to do more because you live in Cyprus. This was kind of like more of an interview format than a discussion. So I just got to like sit back and be brain dead. It was great. Thanks.
Not at all.
I know
we're all you
yeah,
contributed great.
Yeah, I did good, kid. So yeah, guys, everyone's exhausted. So enjoy your weekend. Try to do something that's not this. And we'll start fresh on Monday, y'all. And I think that is going to be a wrap for today. Thanks so much again, Alina, for coming on and talking about this, your area of the world.
My area of the world. It's a crazy area.
Yeah,
but, you know, it is what it is.
Yeah, it's not going to get less crazy, you know?
No, it's going to get worse. But yeah, at least we can talk about it.
Yeah, it's going to get worse before it gets worse. Strap in, folks, and get ready for climate displacement. Enjoy your weekend, you know, as the imperial bourgeoisie fulfill their fiduciary responsibility to denude the earth of all life, maximize shareholder profits, and boil the seas. Wow, I could have ended that better. All right, but anyways, y'all, bye. See you Monday.